Chapter 2 of Joshua. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. "Go look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy the land." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab: "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, "Yes, the man came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly, you may catch up with them." But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So the man set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out of the gate, it was shut. Before the spies laid down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all of us who live in this country are melting with fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you have completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts sank, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death, our lives for your lives." The men assured her, "If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land." So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She said to them, "Go to the hills so that pursuers will not find you. Hide yourself there for 3 days until they return, and then go on your way." Now the men had said to her, "This oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless, when we enter the land, you have tied this scarlet cord on the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers and all your family into your house. If any of them go outside your house into the street, their blood will be on their own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear." "Agreed," she replied, "let it be as you say." So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. When they left, they went into the hills and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them. Then the 2 men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us." That's that.
So the second reading is from the letter to the Hebrews, starting at verse 1, but various verses. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be ill-treated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as a greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect.
So let's pray for ourselves and for David as he speaks to us. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the truths that we can dig out of it with the help of your Spirit and with the help of those who've studied hard. So thank you for David, who's done both of those, listened to you and studied hard to bring this word to us. Amen. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. So, the second in our series, which I believe goes on to the autumn, looking at the 6th book of the Bible, Joshua. It's worth you reading it, so that maybe you can have some background to what's being said on a Sunday. I find it not a very easy book to read, but we'll get into that as weeks come by. Now, one of the privileges of being the leader of the council was that I got to visit different people in different places. And one of the projects that I visited was called the Jericho Road Project, based here in Nottingham. It was set up by churches to support women who make a living by selling their bodies for sex. Maybe to fund a drug habit, maybe to make ends meet, maybe through exploitation. But people who are volunteers stand alongside those women and help them with things like food, with their health needs, with counselling. And they are, in a very real sense, bringing Jesus to those women here in our city. And actually, some of them have come to know the Lord through that charity. Maybe we don't expect the Bible to include people who are sex workers. But this morning's story is about how God included a prostitute in his plans. So, we're in the 6th book of the Bible. And the book of Joshua picks up the promise that was given to Abraham right at the very beginning, that he was to leave his own land and God would give him a new land. He would be a father of a great nation, and there would be a land for them to live in. Leave your home and go to a land that I will give you. And this was a promise that generations later God's people held on to. You remember that when the famine was in Canaan and Jacob and Joseph's brothers went down to Egypt to get food and eventually settled there it was all okay to begin with, but then they grew too many in number, and the Egyptians thought, hang on a minute, we're not having these people overtake us, and they took them into slavery, and they were there for 400 years in Egypt as slaves. And then, as we read the story of them escaping, crossing the Red Sea under Moses' leadership, and then spent 40 years wandering round the wilderness. There had been an opportunity early on in those 40 years. We read this in Numbers chapter 13, when actually Moses sent 12 spies into the land of Canaan and said, is this possibility, lads? Can we take it? And 10 of them came back and said, a bit like builders when they look at your work, it's going to cost you. Those blokes are really big. They're giants. We're never going to get in here. And although 2 came back and said, the land is beautiful and there's grapes that are beautiful and, it'll be a lovely place for us to live, Moses took the majority view. And so they carried on for 40 years wandering round. And then at the end, we come to the book of Joshua. And Paul spoke to us last week from chapter 1. How God had told them that the land that they'd been long promised would be given to them, that they got across the Jordan and that they would be there. It said, just as God had said to Moses when he was reluctant to go and see Pharaoh, I will be with you. And they needed to trust in him. And that's where we are. And so, for a second time, the spies were sent into the land. Now, I'm not sure if they were James Bond type spies, not sure if they went in disguise, but they ended up in Rahab's house, a house at the edge of the city, probably known as a house of ill repute. She's called various times a prostitute and a harlot, although Paul was talking to me to say that in actually some interpretations it could have meant that she was a publican. But anyway, the spies ended up in her house on the edge of Jericho, and there they stayed. And when the authorities heard that they were there, came banging at the door, she hid them in the roof under the flax. You could see it being made into a film, couldn't you, with dramatic music and everyone being quiet so that the spies wouldn't be found. Why did they go to Rahab's house? They hadn't kind of got an appointment. Maybe because there were lots of men going in and out of that house, so they thought they wouldn't be noticed. Maybe because it was on the edge of the city and was the first one they came to. And we learn later that that was how they escaped, with the red rope being tied in the window. Or maybe it was all part of God's plan for his people, that they would be encouraged. Because when we get in a minute to Rahab's testimony, it was amazing. How did she know that? It didn't bring fear to the spies, but she encouraged them. Sometimes when God might be asking us to do something and we're not sure whether it's the right thing, then it's good to hear the voices of others on the subject. They act as an encouragement to us to hear God's voice through them. And that's what Rahab did. By saying what she did, the spies went back in good heart to Joshua and said, yes, this is a good sign that God is with us. When we get into the rest of the book, you'll see that in some ways this chapter is a bit of a distraction. The rest of the book is crossing the Jordan and the walls of Jericho coming down and various bits of God's people taking the land. So why have this story here? It's a bit of a distraction from the main narrative. But Rahab knows something of what has happened to the people of Israel. In verse 10, she says, we have heard. Now, how in those days did they hear it? She hadn't seen it on the news, had she? She hadn't read it on Facebook about this crossing the Red Sea and various encounters with kings along the way. How did she know? We don't know. Sometimes just like we don't know the way that people have picked up understanding about God, right and wrong, from the things that have happened in their lives. It's been interesting to read those reports of download about how different people have come to the chaplaincy tent with different experiences of faith. We don't know how people have picked things up, what their impressions of God will be. But Rahab has not only heard, she's drawn her own conclusions. She says, with no apparent teaching from anywhere, the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. And we're fearful because we know that he is with you. How would she work that out? It's unlikely to have been other followers of God in Jericho. Maybe it was because God revealed it directly to her. No wonder her faith is included in the book of Joshua, because it's a remarkable story. Nearly everybody else who follows Jesus has had somebody to tell them about it. And here she is in the land of Canaan, where many difficult practices of child sacrifice, worshipping lots of other gods, were apparently the character of the story. And yet she is here declaring the truths about God. And because she's heard, and because she's drawn her conclusions, she then acts and she protects the spies. It surely would have been much easier for her to say, yeah, come on, they're here, come and get them. But something in her makes her loyal to the spies, and she hides them in a roof and then doesn't tell the truth. Some commentator that I was reading said, surely that's a bit dodgy, isn't it? She's telling lies. That's not something that should be advocated in the Bible. And the commentator said it's like somebody opening a fridge full of beautiful food, only for the person who has seen the food in the fridge to run the finger along the top and say, oh, there's a bit of dust on there. So she hears, she draws her own conclusions, she acts, and she pleads for mercy. Please protect me and my family, which is what they do. And we read in chapter 6 that when the people do enter Jericho, Rahab and her family are protected. A man walked into a bookstore and asked the woman behind the counter, have you got the book called Man, the Master of Women? Try the fiction section, said the woman. Throughout my life in the church, there has been different expectations of how God uses men and women. When I was a child and a teenager growing up, women in the church were not allowed to pray out loud. In my early 20s, it was unusual to hear a woman preach, and certainly they were in the minority of any leadership team. And although things have changed, I think we should be careful not to lapse into an expectation that God is more likely to use a man than a woman, because the Bible does not bear that out. In a hugely patriarchal society, where a woman really wouldn't even be trusted to give evidence in a court, this is not the only woman that God highlights in his word to demonstrate his purposes. Rahab knew what it was to be used by men for their gratification. But this story tells us of how Rahab was used by God for his glory. What the story shows us is that each one of us can be used by God, and we should be open to him doing that, and that nothing in our present or in our past should be make us think that we're not part of his plans, because we are. But Joshua, as Andrew read us, is not the only place in the Bible where we see the story of Rahab. I got a bit worried where in the Psalms, I think it is, and maybe some of the other prophets, it talks about smashing Rahab to pieces. But that's not this Rahab. That's apparently a reference to Egypt as a country, and Rahab was the word used, not this person. But Rahab is in the Bible in two other places. In the first chapter of Matthew, where you have that great big long list of the genealogy of Jesus, and I thought it was a bit mean, Hugh, to ask anyone to read that out this morning. Now, I remember Alison preaching on it once. In the genealogy of Jesus, we found that in the first chapter of Matthew that Rahab became the mother of Boaz, whose story we find in the book of Ruth, and that she was the great-great-grandmother of King David, him who wrote many of the Psalms and fought the big giant. And that down the generations, Rahab the prostitute is in the line of the generations that lead to Mary and Joseph and the birth of Jesus. I would think that the people in that genealogy have some special place in God's purposes. And the other place, as Andrew read us, was Rahab is mentioned in the book of Hebrews 11, where people are commended for their faith. In a chapter where people whose great faith is praised, people who were sure of what they hoped for and certain of what they had not seen, Rahab the prostitute is included. It was her faith that meant that she believed and trusted the Israelite spies. In this list of the greats, Rahab is the only woman named apart from Mary, alongside men that are much more known. Now, some of you are blessed enough to be parents and grandparents. While working for an organisation that delivers lunches to elderly housebound people, I used to take my 4-year-old granddaughter on my afternoon rounds. She unfailingly was intrigued by the various appliances of old age, particularly the canes, the walking frames, and the wheelchairs. And one day I found her staring at a pair of false teeth soaking in a glass. As I braced myself for the inevitable barrage of questions, she merely turned and whispered, "The tooth fairy will never believe that." So Rahab is praised for her faith, but she's also mentioned as a key person, with her son and her great-great-grandson being significant in Bible characters. If you read this book of Ruth, only 4 chapters, I believe, Boaz is seen as a man of great kindness to Ruth, who is at that point a refugee in the land. I wonder how he learnt to be kind and compassionate. Could it have had something to do with his mum? Many of you are parents and grandparents, as I said. Don't underestimate the influence that you can have on your children and your grandchildren, whether they're following Jesus yet or not. On my mum's side, my grandma died when I was 4, and my granddad, and this is the only picture I've got of him, can't really see, died when I was 8. I do have some memories of him. He was a farmer. He was a gentleman. My mum said he would cry at his worst enemy's funeral. And he gave a little bit of his land to build a church building for the church that my family built. In fact, he died a month before that building was opened. And so although I haven't enjoyed his company throughout anything other than my early life, I do remember him and the attitude that he had. I'm sure you pray regularly for your children and your grandchildren, but don't forget how important you are in their lives. You can be an influence on them. You can demonstrate God's love to them. On Thursday, we're going to remember somebody who clearly had an influence over her children and her grandchildren and pointed them to Jesus. So whether we've got children, grandchildren or not, let's pray that we can all be demonstrators of the character of Jesus to those that we love, and like Rahab, testify to his goodness and his greatness. Thank you.